how we extract energy from our food, and how exercise and what we eat combined can actually impact things like body composition and overall health.
What happens when we eat food of any kind, and how is that actually converted into energy as a way of framing up the discussion around weight loss, weight maintenance, weight gain, and body composition?
It's a great question. This is one of those things where, people use the term calories in, calories out. What is a calorie? So a calorie just refers to a unit of energy, of heat specifically. When you think about the balance of energy in versus energy out, first of all, you've got to realize that the energy inside of the equation is more difficult to track than people think. So one, food labels can have up to a 20% error in them.
Really?
Oh yeah.
So 100 calorie, something listed as 100 calories per serving, what's actually in there could be 80 or 120.
Right, exactly. So now let's look at the energy outside of the equation. The first one and the biggest one is your resting metabolic rate, so your RMR. And that for most people is anywhere from 50 to 70% of your total daily energy expenditure. Now, people use the term metabolic rate and energy expenditure kind of interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. So your total daily energy expenditure is the summation of all the energy you expend in a day.
Walking upstairs,
Everything.
Exercise if you do it,
fidgeting,
plus your resting metabolic.
Right. So resting metabolic rate is a big part of that, but it's not the only thing. So that's usually about 50 to 70%. And sedentary people will be on the higher end of that. So it'll be a bigger proportion, whereas people who are more active, it'll be a little bit lower, not because their metabolic rate is lower, but because they're expending a greater percentage of their calories from physical activity. Then you have something called the thermic effective food, which is a relatively small percentage of your total daily energy expenditure. It's about 5 to 10%. That refers to the amount of energy it takes to extract the energy out of food. So think about your body kind of like a car. You don't just have gas in your tank and it spontaneously starts up, right? Like you have to have a battery, so you put in energy so you can get the energy out of the petrol that you have in your car. So that's the TEF bucket and the BMR bucket. Then we go to physical activity. And physical activity is essentially two parts. There's exercise, which is kind of your purposeful movements, like you go out for a walk, you do a training session, any purposeful activity. And then you have what's called NEAT, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which I think is actually really cool.
It's fascinating.
So I was actually hanging out with somebody last night and I was noticing them. They were fidgeting their feet and their fingers. And I said, have you always been pretty lean? And they were like, yeah, I never really had a problem maintaining leanness. And when you look at the obese resistant phenotype, people think they have high BMR or, they exercise a lot. And really what it seems to be is NEAT. They tend to, if they overeat, they just spontaneously increase their physical activity. Now, people get NEAT confused. I've heard people say, well, I'm going to go out for a walk to get my NEAT up. That's not NEAT. NEAT is not something you can consciously modify. What you're doing there, if it's purposeful, it's exercise. So for example, if I'm waving around my hands, if I'm tapping my feet, if I'm whatever, that's NEAT. But trying to get yourself, well, I'm just going to tap my foot more. Well, now if I'm consciously having to do this, then my focus, you know how the brain works. It's very hard to do, you don't really do two things at once. The next thing is a lot of people weigh very sporadically. And I'll tell people, if you're going to make an intentional weight loss a goal, typically I tell people weigh in first thing in the morning or after you go to the bathroom, do it every day and take the average of that for the week and then compare that to the next week's average. The reason I recommend doing that is I've had it before where week to week my average didn't change, but between the lowest weigh-in from a previous week and the highest weigh-in might have been 8 pounds, right? So if you're somebody who just randomly is weighing in and you're eating in a calorie deficit and you just weigh in one day where you've just whatever reason holding some more fluid, then see, this isn't working. When in reality, your average might be dropping. So that's one of the reasons. And actually, believe it or not, weight fluctuations are actually identified as a major reason why people get discouraged from weight loss. Now, if you look at the literature overall on exercise and appetite, it's not always what you'd expect. Consistently, it seems to show that exercise actually has an appetite suppressant effect. So people don't tend to compensate, at least fully, for the amount of movement they do. And there is some evidence that you've probably heard people say, well, exercise is a really poor weight loss tool, right? Like if you figure out how many calories you should be burning from it and you do that, you end up getting less weight loss than you would predict. Well, one thing I would say is that exercise, independent of anything that happens with your body weight, you will be healthier. So exercise is one of the only things that will actually improve your biomarkers of health without even losing weight. It'll improve your insulin sensitivity, inflammation, all that stuff. So everybody out there looking for a hack to be healthier, exercise is the hack. When you're talking about weight loss, people miss the point of exercise, I think. There's some work that came out from Herman Poncer as well that basically showed if you do 100 calories from exercise, you have a like 28 calorie reduction in your basal metabolic rate in response to that. So it's kind of like this constrained energy expenditure model. But what I would say is, okay, well, there's still a net of 72, right? And the other thing is, I think the effects of exercise on weight loss are actually more due to what it does to appetite. So if you look at people who lose weight and keep it off for a number of years, over 70% of them engage in regular exercise. Of people who do not keep weight loss, like maintain weight loss, less than 30% exercise regularly. There are some pretty compelling studies showing that exercise increases your sensitivity to satiety signals. So basically you can have the same satiety signals, but you're more sensitive to them when you exercise. Now, some people, again, that's, studies report averages, right? And there's individual data points. So there are some people who at least anecdotally report that exercise makes them more hungry. That's completely valid. It could be their beliefs around it. It could be a number of different things, but it's important to understand that there is individual variability. Why do we have such a hard time with losing weight, but more so keeping it off? Because of obese people, 6 out of every 7 obese people will lose a significant amount of body weight in their life. So why do we still have an obesity problem? They don't keep it off. Why don't they keep it off? When you look at the research, basically what it suggests is because people think about, I'm going to do a diet and I'm going to lose this weight, and they do not give any thought to what happens afterwards. If you do a diet and you lose, 30 pounds, fantastic. But if you then just go back to all your old habits, you're going to go back to where you were, if not more. So what I'll tell people is, because people say, well, I'm doing a carnivore diet, or I'm doing this diet or that diet. And I'll say, that's fine. Do you see yourself doing that for the rest of your life? And if the answer is yes, if you really believe that that's going to be sustainable for you, and plenty of people, low carb, intermittent fasting, whatever, they say, felt easy. I could do this forever. Great. If you're going to lose weight, you have to invoke some form of restriction, whether it is a nutrient restriction, like low carb, low fat, a time restriction, intermittent fasting, any form of time restricted eating, or calorie restriction, tracking macros, whatever. You get to pick the form of restriction. So pick the form of restriction that feels the least restrictive to you as an individual. What is the diet that's going to be easiest for you to adhere to in the long term? And you should probably do that.
What do you think about just a general statement that we should try and eat foods that are low to no, minimally to not processed for about 80% of our foods? Is that a reasonable number?
It's hard to actually get, completely unprocessed food because almost everything goes through some form of process.
Right, like an apple or a banana or something. Like oatmeal, like ground oats, to me, as long as there isn't a bunch of other stuff in there, would be minimally processed. Yeah. A steak is not really processed, although it's cut off the animal, etc. So there's a few steps in there, but that's what I mean.
Yeah. So I would 100% agree with what you said, that if you were going to make a broad stroke, that trying to focus on minimally processed foods is very important. The one caveat I would say is I think it's important to understand why, because otherwise people can make this weird association that, like, if I eat any minimally or any processed food, it's going to kill me, or like every time I eat it, it's like I'm smoking a cigarette and my health, my longevity is declining. Based on the studies we have, it's mostly about the energy. That processed food just gets people to spontaneously eat more. Kevin Hall showed this. They basically took people from a minimally processed food diet and then gave them access to ultra processed foods, very few instructions, just eat till you feel satisfied, and they spontaneously increased their calorie intake by 500 calories a day. I mean, that's massive. Like, there's a right way to do plant-based, and then there's, like what's in some of these documentaries where they're eating like plant-based mac and cheese. And again, hey, I love a good mac and cheese, but that should not be pitched as a healthy diet just because it's plant-based, right? Because you're eating a highly processed food that's very palatable and easy to overeat. Same thing for keto. You've now got like keto ice creams, and you've got, keto cookies and all these sorts of things. And I'm like, yeah. And if you look at them, they actually have more calories than the normal stuff. And I'm like, yeah, this is completely missing the point here. So yes, I think minimizing the amount of processed food you consume can be important. Now, that being said, it depends on the individual and their goals. If your goal is to, for example, build muscle or maintain a high body weight for a sport, for example, like an NFL offensive lineman or something of that nature, like for them, processed foods may actually be a tool. So your protein, your fiber, your micronutrients, these are your responsibilities. But those become much easier to hit when you have higher calories, right? So if you're eating 4,000 calories a day for whatever goal you have, have, you're probably going to have some left over, and like good luck eating 4,000 calories from minimally processed food. And so that's why I'm so pedantic and a stickler about saying, okay, yes, it's a good idea to eat minimally processed food and try to avoid processed foods, but not because processed foods are bad per se, but what the outcome tends to be from a lot of processed food consumption, which is over-consuming calories and then therefore, energy toxicity negatively contributing to your health.
What do you think of that sort of approach, cutting caloric intake in half and also doubling your physical output?
Research data actually tends to suggest that people who are like obese, who lose a lot more weight early, are more likely to keep it off. So for a lot of overweight or obese people, if they start a diet and they don't see something quickly, they kind of bail on it because it's not working. Whereas if they see some rapid results pretty quickly, they buy in even harder, right? You're having a trade-off here. You're going to lose fat faster. You might lose lean mass a little bit faster too, which can be a problem. But I will say, the more adipose tissue you have, the more aggressively you can diet without negative consequences. Somebody like me doing a really aggressive diet is not going to be good for my lean mass. One, I have a higher lean mass than normal. Two, I have a lower body fat than normal. As your body fat goes down, the percentage of weight loss from lean mass goes up. So people who are very obese, because they have so much adipose tissue to pull from, there's very little reason for the body to catabolize lean tissue. So it's normal to lose, for the average person to lose like 25 or 30% of the weight that they lose from lean mass. But balance that with, okay, if I'm going to do this, I need to understand that I'm not going to be dieting this way forever. I'm doing this to give myself a boost at the beginning, and I have to be okay at some point with transitioning to something that's a little bit more sustainable. Interestingly, the dichotomy of life is, if you do what's easy in the short term, your life will be hard. If you do what's hard in the short term, your life will get easier.